The thunder that split the sky, the 1965 tornado that shattered faith and fear in the Midwest. Chapter 1. April 11th, 1965. A Sunday morning that began with the quiet rustle of church dresses and the warm scent of Easter lilies. In small towns across Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, families gathered around breakfast tables, children in their Sunday best, parents sipping coffee while the radio played hymns. The sky was impossibly blue. The air carried the first true warmth of spring after a March that had buried the Midwest under 3 feet of snow. In Grand Rapids alone, it had been the snowiest month ever recorded. But on this Palm Sunday, winter seemed like a distant memory. Thermometers climbed into the 70s by noon. Farmers stepped outside to survey their thawing fields. Mothers opened kitchen windows for the first time in months. Children ran barefoot through yards still soft from melting snow. No one looked up. No one questioned the strange yellow tint that crept across the horizon. No one knew that within hours, the thunder would split the sky, and nothing would ever be the same again. In Dunlap, Indiana, a small community nestled along the St. Joseph River, the morning unfolded like any other Palm Sunday. The Methodist Church on Main Street, filled with worshippers clutching palm fronds, their voices rising in hymns of redemption. 6-year-old Debbie Forsyth sat between her parents in the third pew, her white dress starched and pressed, her patent leather shoes swinging above the floor. Her older brother Stevie, just 8 years old, fidgeted beside her, impatient for the service to end so he could play outside. Their father, a factory worker at the local plant, kept one hand on his son's shoulder, gently steadying him. Their mother smiled, her face soft with the peace that only Sunday mornings could bring. Outside, the temperature continued to rise. The unusual warmth felt like a gift after such a brutal winter. Families made plans for afternoon picnics. Children begged to visit the lake. Grandparents settled into porch chairs, faces turned toward the sun. In the Forsyth home on Cole Street, Easter decorations waited on the dining room table, ready for the celebration that would come in 1 week. Colored eggs sat in the refrigerator. A chocolate bunny wrapped in foil waited in the pantry. None of it would survive the night. Across the state line in Michigan, the morning was equally serene. In the small town of Rockford, Margaret Tannis and her husband Glenn loaded their 3 daughters into the family car for a birthday party at her mother's house in Pearson. Brenda was 5.5, Annette was 3, and little Crystal had just turned 18 months. The car smelled of cake frosting and fresh flowers. Margaret adjusted the rearview mirror, checking on her girls in the back seat. The sky was clear, the road empty, the day stretching before them with quiet promise. She had no way of knowing that by evening she would be throwing herself over her children's bodies, praying to survive winds that would tear the world apart around them. In Hillsdale County, the Bear Lake area was coming alive with springtime activity. Vacation cottages along Borbees Lake were opening for the season. Families arrived with fishing poles and picnic baskets, eager to reclaim their summer retreats after months of ice and snow. The McCready family was among them. Robert McCready and his wife, who was expecting their second child, had brought their not-quite 3-year-old daughter, Cheryl Marie, to visit a neighbor's trailer near the lake. The women chatted while Cheryl played with toys on the floor. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, warm and golden. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Birds sang in the trees that lined the shore. The peace was absolute. It was the kind of day that made people believe in mercy. But mercy was not coming. Not today. Far to the west, over the plains of Iowa and Illinois, the atmosphere was building towards something catastrophic. Meteorologists at the Weather Bureau had been tracking an unusual weather pattern for days. A powerful low-pressure system had formed over the Dakotas, drawing warm, humid air up from the Gulf of Mexico, while simultaneously pulling cold, dry air down from Canada. The collision point was the Midwest. By mid-morning, weather balloons launched from Dodge City, Kansas, recorded wind speeds of 185 miles per hour in the upper atmosphere. Another balloon over Peoria, Illinois, measured winds of 155 miles per hour. The jet stream was roaring overhead like an invisible freight train, creating the perfect conditions for disaster. The technical term is wind shear, the rapid change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes. On April 11, 1965, the wind shear over the Great Lakes region was among the most intense ever recorded. When combined with the unprecedented heat and humidity at ground level, it created an atmosphere primed for violent rotation. The stage was set. The actors did not know they were about to perform. In Cedar Rapids, Iowa, meteorologist Conrad Johnson arrived at the WMT television station for his afternoon shift. He had been watching the weather maps with growing concern since the previous day. The data was alarming. All the ingredients for severe weather were present in abundance. He issued an early bulletin, advising viewers to stay alert. But in 1965, the terminology was confusing. The Weather Bureau issued what they called tornado forecasts, when conditions were favorable, and tornado warnings when a funnel had been confirmed. Most of the public did not understand the difference. They heard forecast and assumed it was merely a prediction, not an imminent threat. They heard warning and thought it was simply an update. The distinction would cost lives before the night was over. By early afternoon, the first thunderstorms began to form over eastern Iowa. They appeared innocent at first, just clusters of white clouds building against the blue sky, but within the clouds, invisible forces were at work. Rising columns of warm air, called updrafts, punched through the atmosphere with tremendous force. As they rose, they began to rotate, spinning faster and faster as the wind shear twisted them into tight spirals. By 1:45 in the afternoon, the first tornado touched down near Tipton, Iowa. It was small and brief, causing minimal damage, but it was only the beginning. Behind it, the storm system was intensifying. Supercells, the most dangerous form of thunderstorm, were forming in a line that stretched for hundreds of miles. Each one was a factory of destruction, capable of producing multiple tornadoes in succession. The outbreak had begun. At 3 in the afternoon, a tornado formed northwest of Rockford, Illinois, and tracked northeast toward the Wisconsin border, damaging homes and farms along its path. Another tornado touched down near Geneva and St. Charles, destroying a dozen homes along U.S. Route 30. But these were merely the opening acts. The main performance was still hours away, gathering strength over the cornfields of Illinois, preparing to cross into Indiana as evening fell. In the small towns that lay in its path, people continued with their Sunday routines. They attended church services. They ate Sunday dinners. They took afternoon naps. They had no idea what was coming. The Weather Bureau had issued bulletins, but many people were outdoors enjoying the weather. Radios played to empty rooms. Televisions displayed warnings to no one. In Goshen, Indiana, teenager James Mitchell was helping his father in the family barn, preparing for the spring planting season. The warmth of the day made the work pleasant, and they stopped frequently to wipe sweat from their foreheads and drink cold water from a metal canteen. James's mother called them in for supper around 5 o'clock. The sky to the west had taken on an unusual color, a sickly greenish yellow that made everything look slightly off. His father paused at the barn door, staring at the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Something's not right," he said, but he could not articulate what it was. The feeling was instinctual, primal, the same awareness that makes animals seek shelter before a storm. James would remember that moment for the rest of his life, his father standing silhouetted against the strange sky, sensing danger he could not name. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Weather Bureau station in Chicago issued an urgent bulletin. Severe thunderstorms with possible tornadoes were expected across northern Indiana and southern Michigan. The bulletin was broadcast on television and radio, but by 6 on a Sunday evening, many families were at church, attending evening services. Others were outside, reluctant to go inside on such a beautiful day after months of being trapped by winter. The warnings reached only a fraction of the people who needed to hear them. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed, not because of negligence, but because the technology and terminology of the era were simply inadequate to communicate the scale of what was about to happen. The first supercell crossed into Indiana around 6:30 in the evening. It was a monster, a rotating column of energy that stretched from the ground to the top of the atmosphere. Radar operators watched in disbelief as the storm's signature bloomed across their screens, larger and more intense than anything they had seen before. Within the storm, the rotation had tightened into a funnel. At 6:47, it touched the ground near the town of Wyatt, carving a path of destruction through the rural landscape. Barns disintegrated, trees were snapped like matchsticks, cars were lifted from roads and thrown into fields, and it was only the beginning. Behind it, more storms were lining up like soldiers, each one ready to deliver its own devastation. Verifique se você já está inscrito neste canal. Se esta história já tocou algo em você, imagine o que está por vir. Tornados duplos, famílias separadas, e uma noite que mudaria para sempre a forma como a América entende as tempestades. Não perca um único capítulo. Inscreva-se agora. Chapter 2. The clock on the kitchen wall of the Eads family home in Dunlap showed 7:10 when 13-year-old Les Eads first heard the sound. He had been watching television in the living room, a special broadcast showing President Lyndon B. Johnson's motorcade through some distant city. The image flickered, and Les thought at first that the signal was failing. Then he heard it, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, deeper and louder than anything he had ever experienced. It was not like a freight train. It was louder than a freight train, he would later say. It was louder than anything I had words for. His mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her voice sharp with fear. Basement. Now. Les grabbed his younger brother and sisters and ran for the stairs. In the Forsyth home on Cole Street, 6-year-old Debbie had just finished her Sunday supper when the windows began to rattle. Her father looked up from his plate, listening. The light outside had changed, turning the familiar world into something alien and threatening. Through the window, Debbie could see the trees bending at impossible angles, their leaves stripped away and replaced by flying debris. Her mother screamed and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the hallway. There was no basement in their home, no safe room, nowhere to hide from what was coming. They crouched against an interior wall, parents covering children with their bodies, whispering prayers that were swallowed by the wind. The tornado that struck Dunlap was later rated F4 on the Fujita scale, with winds estimated between 207 and 260 miles per hour. It was over a mile wide at its peak, a wall of rotating destruction that erased everything in its path. The Sunnyside subdivision, where the Forsyth family lived, took a direct hit. Houses that had stood for decades were reduced to piles of unrecognizable debris in seconds. The tornado did not discriminate. It took the old and the young, the wealthy and the poor, the faithful and the doubting. It took 8-year-old Stevie Forsyth, ripped from his mother's arms and carried into the darkness. His body would be found the next morning, half a mile from where his home had stood. At the Eads house, the family huddled in the basement as the world above them disappeared. Les could feel his ears popping from the pressure change, the air being sucked out of the room like water down a drain. The sound was indescribable, a grinding, roaring, screaming cacophony that seemed to last forever. In reality, the tornado passed over them in less than a minute. When the noise finally stopped, Les opened his eyes to see stars. Not through a window, but directly above him. The roof was gone. The second floor was gone. Even most of the first floor had been torn away. Only the basement and a few feet of wall remained. They had survived by feet, by inches, by the grace of something Les still cannot name. Across the county, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. The Midway trailer court near Dunlap was hit by what witnesses described as a double-barrel tornado, two funnels rotating around each other like dancers in a deadly waltz. The trailers, lightweight and unanchored, were lifted into the air and shredded. Families were thrown hundreds of yards. Bodies were found in trees, in fields, in the wreckage of homes that had stood half a mile away. A photographer from the Elkhart Truth newspaper, Paul Huffman, managed to capture an image of the twin funnels before they struck. The photograph would become iconic, a visual representation of the outbreak's ferocity. In Hillsdale County, Michigan, the storm arrived with equal fury. The tornado that swept through the Bear Lake area was one of the largest of the outbreak, cutting a swath of destruction through vacation cottages, permanent homes, and everything between. At the trailer where the McCready family was visiting, young Cheryl Marie's mother heard the approaching storm and threw herself on top of her daughter, holding on with a grip that even unconsciousness could not break. The tornado picked up the trailer and tore it apart. When rescuers found them hours later, the mother was pinned under a refrigerator and a sink, her legs partially paralyzed, but her daughter still clutched tightly in her arms. The force of impact had knocked her unconscious, but her grip had never loosened. Her arms had to be pried open to free the child, who had survived without serious injury. The storms continued to march eastward, spawning tornado after tornado in a relentless assault on the Midwest. In northern Indiana, the town of Russiaville was struck by an F4 that killed 7 people. In Miami County, another tornado killed 6 more. In Ohio, a series of twisters carved paths from Lima to Strongsville, just southwest of Cleveland, killing more than 40 people in a single county. By the time the last tornado lifted back into the clouds after midnight, the outbreak had produced at least 47 confirmed tornadoes across 6 states. The death toll would eventually reach 271, with more than 3,400 injured. It was the 4th deadliest tornado outbreak in American history, but statistics cannot capture what happened that night, Numbers cannot convey the terror of a mother shielding her children as the walls collapsed around her. They cannot express the grief of a father searching through wreckage for a son who would never come home. They cannot measure the courage of neighbors who rushed into darkness to pull strangers from debris, risking their own lives to save others they had never met. The Palm Sunday tornado outbreak was not just a weather event. It was a test of everything that makes us human. In the chaos that followed the storms, ordinary people became heroes. In Dunlap, volunteer firefighters worked through the night, digging through collapsed homes by flashlight, calling out names and listening for responses. Farmers drove their tractors into town, using them to clear debris from roads so that ambulances could reach the injured. Churches that had been spared opened their doors as shelters, their pews becoming beds for the suddenly homeless. Strangers shared food, blankets, and comfort with people they had never met. The Eads family emerged from their ruined basement to find a landscape that looked like a landfill. Every house on their street had been damaged or destroyed. Power lines hung in tangled webs from broken poles. Trees lay across roads, their roots pointing toward the sky. The air smelled of broken wood and wet earth and something else, something chemical and sharp. Les walked through the debris in a daze, unable to process what he was seeing. His mother found a neighbor wandering in shock, still wearing her Sunday dress, now torn and stained with mud. They took her in, found her a blanket, made her sit down until her husband could be located. In the Forsyth home, or what remained of it, 6-year-old Debbie was pulled from the rubble with minor injuries. Her parents had survived as well. But her brother Stevie was gone, taken by the wind into a darkness from which there was no return. The family was reunited at the local hospital, where doctors and nurses worked frantically to treat hundreds of injured victims. Debbie's father, his face grey with shock and grief, wandered the halls looking for his son, refusing to believe what the searchers had told him. It was not until the next morning, when the body was recovered, that the terrible truth could no longer be denied. The sun rose on April 12th to reveal a landscape of devastation that stretched for hundreds of miles. Aerial photographs taken that day showed entire neighborhoods reduced to bare foundations, farms with nothing left but concrete slabs, forests stripped of every leaf and branch. President Lyndon B. Johnson flew to Indiana to survey the damage, walking through the wreckage of Dunlap with a face that showed the weight of what he was witnessing. Governor George Romney of Michigan declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was deployed to maintain order and prevent looting, though there was little left to steal. The Red Cross and Salvation Army set up relief stations, distributing food and clothing and hope to those who had lost everything. Chapter 3. In the days following the outbreak, as the initial shock began to fade, questions emerged. How had this happened? Why had so many people been caught unprepared? The storms had not appeared without warning. The Weather Bureau had issued bulletins throughout the afternoon and evening. Forecasters had recognized the dangerous conditions and tried to alert the public. Yet hundreds of people had been caught outside, unaware of the approaching danger. Entire communities had been struck without any warning reaching their residents. The system had failed. But why? The answer lay in a combination of factors that together created a perfect storm of miscommunication. First, the terminology was confusing. The Weather Bureau distinguished between tornado forecasts, which indicated favorable conditions, and tornado warnings, which indicated confirmed tornadoes. But the public did not understand this distinction. Many people heard forecast and assumed it was merely a prediction, something that might happen, but probably would not. They heard warning and thought it was simply an update to the forecast, not an urgent call to seek shelter immediately. The difference in meaning was lost in translation. Second, the technology of 1965 was limited. There was no internet, no smartphone alerts, no weather apps that could send notifications directly to people's pockets. Weather information was broadcast on television and radio, but it reached only those who were actively watching or listening. On a beautiful Sunday evening, after months of winter confinement, many people were outside enjoying the first warm day of spring. Radios played to empty rooms. Televisions displayed warnings to no one. The message was sent but never received. Third, there was no standardized system for alerting the public to imminent danger. Some communities had civil defense sirens, but most did not activate them for tornado warnings. The sirens were associated with nuclear attack, not weather emergencies. People who heard them often assumed they were being tested or malfunctioning. The connection between the sound of the siren and the need to seek shelter had not been established. The investigation that followed the Palm Sunday outbreak led to fundamental changes in how America communicates about severe weather. In a meeting at the WMT television station in Cedar Rapids, officials from the Severe Storms Forecast Center in Kansas City met with local meteorologists to discuss the problem. The conversation that took place in that studio would reshape weather communication for generations. They agreed that the terminology needed to change. The confusing terms forecast and warning would be replaced with a new system. A tornado watch would indicate conditions favorable for tornado development. A tornado warning would indicate that a tornado had been spotted or detected on radar. The distinction would be clearer, more intuitive, easier for the public to understand and act upon. Communities also began to recognize the need for better alerting systems. Civil defense sirens were gradually repurposed to warn of severe weather, not just military attack. The network of weather radio stations expanded from 50 stations in 1965 to over 1,000 today, covering 97% of the American population. Storm spotting programs were formalized and expanded, eventually becoming the Skywarn network that trains thousands of volunteers each year to watch for severe weather and report what they see. The tragedy of Palm Sunday became the catalyst for a complete overhaul of how America prepares for and responds to tornadoes. But the lessons came at a terrible cost. In Dunlap, Debbie Forsyth grew up in the shadow of her brother's absence, the empty chair at the dinner table, the bedroom that stayed frozen in time, his toys untouched, his books gathering dust, the photographs on the wall that showed a smiling boy who would never grow old. Debbie carried the weight of that loss for decades, the memory of the storm etched into her psyche in ways she could not fully articulate. Even as an adult, the sound of a tornado siren would trigger instant panic, a visceral response that bypassed rational thought and plunged her back into the terror of that night. When I hear a tornado siren, I cannot really explain that feeling. She would later say, but I mean instant fear, instant fear. Se você está sentindo o peso desta história, deixe comentário agora mesmo dizendo: Nunca vou esquecer Steve. Esse comentário é mais do que palavras. É uma forma de honrar a memória de todas as crianças que perderam suas vidas naquela noite. Deixe seu comentário agora e faça parte desta homenagem. Chapter 4. In the aftermath of destruction, something remarkable emerged from the rubble. It was not visible in the aerial photographs or the damage assessments. It could not be measured in dollars or counted in statistics, but it was there. Woven into every story that survivors would tell for generations, it was the human response to tragedy, the instinct to help, to comfort, to rebuild. In Comstock Park, Michigan, teacher Dorothy Henderson had been grading papers in her living room when the storm struck. Her home was damaged but survivable, the roof partially lifted, windows shattered, furniture overturned. Before the wind had fully stopped, she was already moving toward the door, her mind focused not on her own losses, but on her students. Many of them lived in the mobile home park on the edge of town, the Westgate addition that had taken a direct hit. She drove through debris-strewn streets, navigating around fallen trees and downed power lines, until she reached the Stony Creek School where she taught. Within hours, the Red Cross had set up a disaster center in the building. Dorothy worked through the night, helping to register displaced families, finding blankets for shivering children, making phone calls to help residents contact relatives in other states. She was still there the next morning when school officials arrived, and she stayed for days afterward, serving as a contact person for families who had lost their phones along with everything else. In Alpine Township, the Swan Inn had been a local landmark for decades, a roadside restaurant where travelers stopped for coffee and farmers gathered to discuss the weather. The tornado struck it directly, killing one guest and injuring several others. Among the first to arrive at the scene was the Tanise family, whose car had been caught on the road during the storm. Margaret Tannis had shielded her 3 daughters on the floor of the vehicle as the tornado passed, the car rocking violently but remaining on the ground. When the wind stopped, her husband Glenn immediately ran toward the destroyed inn to help the injured. Margaret stayed with her children, but soon spotted 2 young siblings wandering in shock near the wreckage. She gathered them up, along with her own daughters, and walked them to their nearby home, making sure they were safe before continuing on. The stories of individual heroism multiplied in the days following the outbreak. In Dunlap, a young man named Thomas Crawford worked for 36 hours straight, pulling survivors from collapsed homes, his hands bleeding from digging through debris. He did not know most of the people he helped. Many of them he never saw again. But years later, when asked about that night, he would simply shrug. "It was what you did," he said. "There was work to be done and people needed help. You did not stop to think about it, you just did it." In Branch County, which suffered 18 fatalities, the highest death toll of any Michigan county, the community response was overwhelming. Churches became shelters. Schools became aid stations. Farmers brought food from their untouched properties to feed those who had lost everything. Strangers opened their homes to displaced families, sharing beds and meals with people they had never met. The boundaries between neighbors dissolved. The distances between towns seemed to shrink. For a few days at least, the tragedy created a sense of unity that transcended the ordinary divisions of daily life. The National Guard arrived within hours of the first reports of damage, their trucks carrying supplies, their soldiers providing security and assistance. In Hillsdale County, the 156th Signal Battalion from Adrian established checkpoints to prevent looting and helped clear roads of debris. Governor George Romney toured the affected areas personally, meeting with local officials and walking through the wreckage with survivors. His recommendation that the county be declared an emergency disaster area opened the door for federal assistance, bringing resources that no single community could have provided on its own. The Red Cross mobilized one of the largest disaster responses in its history to that date. Volunteers came from across the country, bringing supplies, expertise, and simple human compassion. The Salvation Army set up feeding stations where the homeless could get hot meals. Local businesses that had been spared contributed whatever they could, from building materials to cash to simple expressions of support. But perhaps the most remarkable response came from the survivors themselves. In the weeks and months that followed, as the cleanup progressed and the rebuilding began, those who had lost everything found ways to help others who had lost even more. The McCready family, whose mother had been partially paralyzed protecting her daughter, became advocates for tornado safety, sharing their story at schools and community events. Les Eads, the teenager who had survived in his basement, eventually became a barber in Dunlap, a familiar presence in a community that had been transformed by tragedy. Every day, he passed the memorial on Cole Street that honored those who had died, including the neighbors and friends whose names were now carved in stone. The rebuilding was slow but steady. Homes were reconstructed on foundations that had been swept clean. New codes were implemented to make buildings more resistant to severe weather. Communities that had been devastated created emergency plans, installed warning sirens, and trained volunteers to respond to future disasters. The lessons of Palm Sunday were written into policy and practice, ensuring that the suffering of 1965 would not be repeated without resistance. Chapter 5. The legacy of the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak extends far beyond the communities that were directly affected. It fundamentally changed how America understands, predicts, and responds to tornadoes. The scientific advances alone would have justified years of research, but more important than any technological improvement was the transformation of public awareness. Before April 11, 1965, many Americans treated tornadoes as random acts of fate, unpredictable and unavoidable. The Weather Bureau had been issuing forecasts for years, but the public largely ignored them. Tornadoes were something that happened to other people, in other places, without warning or reason. The Palm Sunday outbreak shattered that complacency. For the first time, millions of Americans saw the devastating power of tornadoes on their television screens, in their newspapers, in the faces of survivors who had lost everything. The storms were no longer abstract statistics. They were real, they were deadly, and they could happen anywhere. The scientific community responded with unprecedented research. Dr. Tetsuya Theodore Fujita, a Japanese-American meteorologist at the University of Chicago, conducted the first comprehensive aerial survey of tornado damage paths. Flying over the devastated areas in a small plane, he photographed the patterns of destruction from above, looking for clues about how the storms had behaved. What he discovered revolutionized the understanding of tornado dynamics. Fujita noticed that the damage patterns were not uniform. Within the main path of destruction, there were smaller areas of even more intense damage, spiraling patterns that suggested the presence of smaller, more powerful vortices rotating within the larger tornado. He called these suction vortices, and his discovery explained one of the great mysteries of tornado behavior. For years, scientists had wondered why a tornado could destroy one house while leaving the one across the street untouched. The common explanation was that tornadoes jumped, lifting off the ground and skipping over some structures. Fujita showed that this was not the case. Instead, the most intense damage was caused by these smaller vortices, which rotated around the main funnel at tremendous speeds. A house struck by a suction vortex would be obliterated. A house missed by mere feet would survive relatively intact. The randomness was not magical or mysterious. It was physics. Fujita's work on the Palm Sunday outbreak led directly to the development of the Fujita scale, the rating system that is still used today to classify tornado intensity. The scale ranges from F0, with winds of 40 to 72 miles per hour, to F5, with winds exceeding 261 miles per hour. Each rating corresponds to specific types of damage, allowing scientists to estimate wind speeds even when direct measurements are not available. The scale has since been updated to the enhanced Fujita scale, but its foundation remains the research that Fujita conducted in the aftermath of Palm Sunday. The improvements in warning systems were equally significant. The confusion between forecast and warning led directly to the creation of the watch and warning system that is now standard across the country. A tornado watch indicates that conditions are favorable for tornado development. A tornado warning indicates that a tornado has been spotted or detected on radar. The distinction is clear, intuitive, and universally understood. When people hear a tornado warning, they know to seek shelter immediately. The expansion of NOAA weather radio transformed how weather information reaches the public. In 1965, there were only about 50 weather radio stations in the country, mostly serving aviation and marine interests. Following the outbreak, the network expanded rapidly. By the time of the super outbreak in 1974, there were over 125 stations. Today, there are more than 1,000, covering 97% of the American population. The stations broadcast weather forecasts and warnings 24 hours a day, and modern receivers can be programmed to activate automatically when a warning is issued for a specific area. The Skywarn program formalized and expanded the role of volunteer storm spotters, amateur radio operators, emergency responders, and trained citizens across the country now serve as the eyes and ears of the National Weather Service, reporting severe weather observations in real time. Their reports supplement radar data and satellite imagery, providing ground truth that technology alone cannot deliver. The program traces its roots directly to the lessons learned from Palm Sunday, when the lack of coordinated spotting contributed to the failure of warnings to reach affected communities. Even the way communities respond to tornado threats changed fundamentally after 1965. Civil defense sirens, originally intended to warn of nuclear attack, were gradually repurposed to alert the public to severe weather. Emergency management became a recognized profession, with trained professionals developing plans, conducting exercises, and coordinating responses. Schools implemented tornado drills, hospitals created surge plans. The entire framework of disaster preparedness was transformed by the lessons of that single night. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. After Palm Sunday, Americans could no longer pretend that tornadoes happened only to other people. The randomness of the destruction, the way it cut across income levels and geographic boundaries, the sheer scale of the devastation, all of it combined to create a new awareness. Tornadoes were real, they were dangerous, and everyone needed to be prepared. Chapter 6. 60 years have passed since the thunder split the sky over the Midwest. The survivors of that night are now elderly, their memories softened by time, but never quite fading. The children who were pulled from the rubble have become grandparents. Their stories passed down to generations who cannot fully imagine what they experienced. The communities that were devastated have been rebuilt, their streets lined with new homes, their residents protected by warning systems that did not exist in 1965. But the memory persists. In Dunlap, Indiana, a simple stone memorial stands on Cole Street, near where the Forsyth home once stood. The names of the victims are carved into its surface, a permanent reminder of the night when nature tested the limits of human endurance. Debbie Waters, the 6-year-old girl who survived while her brother did not, helped design and build that memorial. She wanted a place where people could come to remember, to reflect, to renew their commitment to being prepared. Her brother Mike visits every time he returns to town. He stands before the stone that bears his brother Stevie's name and remembers the family he once had, the childhood that was shattered by the wind. Les Eade still works as a barber in Dunlap. He has cut hair for generations of local residents, listening to their stories, sharing his own when asked. The hearing loss he suffered that night has never fully healed, a permanent reminder of the roar that was louder than any freight train. But he does not dwell on the injury. He focuses instead on the community that emerged from the tragedy, the neighbors who helped each other rebuild, the strangers who became friends in the shared experience of survival. In Hillsdale County, the Bear Lake area has regained its former beauty. The woods that were stripped bare by the tornado have grown back, their trees now tall and strong. The vacation cottages have been rebuilt, their families returning each summer to enjoy the lake and the peace of the countryside. But older residents still remember. They can point to the exact spots where homes once stood, where neighbors were lost, where the path of destruction carved its way through their lives. The McCready daughter, Cheryl Marie, grew up healthy and strong, unaware of how close she had come to death in her mother's arms. The story of her survival became family legend, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of a mother's love. Her own mother, partially paralyzed but alive, recovered enough to raise both her daughters, her arms forever marked by the force of her grip on that terrible night. The scientific advances that emerged from Palm Sunday have saved countless lives in the decades since. Modern radar systems can detect rotation within thunderstorms minutes before a tornado forms. Doppler technology measures wind speeds in real time, providing warnings with unprecedented accuracy. Satellite imagery shows the development and movement of storm systems across hundreds of miles. Forecasters can now predict severe weather days in advance, giving communities time to prepare. But technology is only part of the equation. The most important legacy of Palm Sunday is human awareness. People today take tornado warnings seriously. They seek shelter when sirens sound. They have plans for their families, their schools, their workplaces. They understand that tornadoes are not random acts of fate, but predictable phenomena that can be anticipated and survived. That understanding was purchased with the lives of 271 people on a Sunday evening in April 1965. The thunder still splits the sky each spring, as it has for millions of years. Tornadoes still form over the plains, still march across the landscape, still test the structures that humans build and the communities that humans create. But America is better prepared now than it was on that Palm Sunday. The warning systems work. The messages get through, the shelters are ready. And in small towns across the Midwest, in Dunlap and Rockford and Hillsdale and all the others, the memory endures. It is carried in the stories that grandparents tell their grandchildren, in the memorials that stand on quiet streets, in the annual observances that bring communities together to remember what was lost and celebrate what survived. The thunder that split the sky in 1965 left scars that will never fully heal, but it also left lessons that will never be forgotten. The wind has claimed its due. It has taken lives and homes and the innocence of a generation, but it has not taken the human spirit. In every community that was devastated, people found the strength to rebuild. They found the courage to help their neighbors. They found the wisdom to learn from tragedy and prepare for the future. That is the true legacy of Palm Sunday. Not the destruction, but the response. Not the fear, but the resilience. Not the death, but the determination to live. The sky is blue now over the towns that were torn apart. Children play in yards where rubble once lay. Families gather for Sunday dinners in homes that rose from the foundations of those that fell. The tornado memorials stand quiet, their stones warmed by the same sun that shone so deceptively on April 11, 1965. And somewhere in the distance, the rumble of thunder reminds us that the sky can still split open, that the wind can still rise, that the test of our humanity is never truly over. But we are ready now. We have learned. We remember. The thunder that split the sky in 1965 changed everything. It shattered faith and fear alike, leaving in their place something stronger, something more prepared, something more connected. The families who lost loved ones that night would give anything to have them back. The communities that were destroyed would give anything to have been spared. But in the absence of that impossible wish, they have given the next generation something invaluable. They have given us the knowledge to survive. They have given us the systems to warn. They have given us the memory to never forget. And so, as another spring arrives in the Midwest, as the air warms and the clouds build and the conditions align for severe weather, we carry with us the lessons of Palm Sunday. We watch the sky. We listen for the warnings. We know where to shelter. We understand that nature will test us again, as it has tested every generation before us. But we also know that we are not powerless. We can prepare, we can respond, we can survive. We can. The thunder may split the sky once more, the wind may rise and roar, but we will be ready. Because we remember Dunlap, we remember Hillsdale, we remember the Forsyth family and the McCready family, and all the families whose names are carved in stone across 6 states. We remember the 13-year-old boy who survived in his basement and grew up to cut hair in the town that nearly killed him. We remember the 6-year-old girl who lost her brother and spent her life building memorials so that others would never forget. We remember. And because we remember, we endure. Se você assistiu até aqui, é porque esta história tocou você de verdade. Deixe um comentário dizendo: eu assisti até o final para que eu possa conhecer você e saber quem realmente aprecia as histórias deste canal. Seu comentário significa muito para nós. E se esta história fez você refletir, por favor, deixe seu like e compartilhe com alguém que também precisa ouvir. Não se esqueça de se inscrever no canal para não perder as próximas histórias. Cada inscrição nos ajuda a continuar contando estas histórias que merecem ser lembradas. Obrigado por estar aqui. Obrigado por lembrar.